Hello, my name is Kevin Howard, and I am the host of the podcast Breadcrumbs, a podcast for people who know it's not working. There is only one topic that the two major anti establishment politicians in America, that is President Donald J. Trump and Senator Bernie Sanders, there's only one topic that these two diametrically opposed politicians agree on, and that is the economy is rigged. Okay. So, here in episode 5, I'm going to talk to you about how extreme wealth intentionally rigged our economics and, in doing so, broke the US economy. So, here we go. Okay. This story begins in August of 1971. Now, stay with me because it affects your bottom line right now. This story begins in August of 1971, 8 days, and it changed the entire trajectory of US economics. And so on August 15th of 1971, Richard Nixon addressed the president of the United States at that time, addressed the American public and announced that he was closing the gold window. Now, up to that point, the US dollar and how many US dollars the Treasury Department could print was a function of how much gold the US government had to have value, because the dollar was valued based on the amount of gold you had. Okay. So when Richard Nixon, on the advice of his senior economic advisors, and the key senior economic advisor who encouraged him to close the gold window was a gentleman named Paul Volcker, who would go on to fame, and we'll get to that part of the story. Significance of President Nixon taking the US dollar off the gold standard was that it empowered the US government through its various means to print as much money as they wanted to. And as there's a theory of economics called modern monetary theory. And what it basically says is that if you are a country whose entire debt is in your own currency and you control how much that currency exists, you're the sole producer of that currency. You can print as much money as you want, and your only limitation is whether or not the result of you printing that money causes inflation. At which point you want to kind of measure that, because now prices are running out of control. Okay. So that's what happened on August 15th, 1971. President Nixon closed the gold window, and the US dollar was officially a fiat currency that the federal government could manipulate for as much as they wanted, and they were only limited by inflation. Then, ironically, 8 days later, and it's ironic because you think, people discount us all the time when they talk about conspiracy theories and, oh, you must be a quack because you're coming up with some conspiracy. Well, these things don't happen by accident. 8 days later, and apparently totally disconnected, on August 23rd, 1971, Lewis Powell published his famous Powell memo that he sent to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And this is where the story is going to really get good and begin, because this was an important memo sent to from a prominent attorney, a prominent corporate attorney. And he wrote it to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And his claim was the American corporation has lost control of the American economy. They've lost control of the country. And his evidence of that was, well, the things that led up to 1971. So just a mini history lesson. I mean, what led up to 1971 was actually a period of some of the greatest prosperity America has ever known. Because a part of the New Deal that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had established in the 30s for the federal government to invest in job creation. And we did things like build, the dam system and the national parks and all these things to put people to work, right? Leading into World War II, where we converted the industrial capacity of the country to produce tanks and aircraft and all the munitions for the war. And then when we came out of that war, victorious, empowered by a banking system that we regained confidence because FDR had established federal deposit insurance. We were triumphant from a major war against a country that was the greatest threat in U.S. history, the Germans. Empowered by things like the GI Bill, which sent a whole new class of Americans to college for free. And the VA bill, which allowed Americans who never were able to afford to buy a home with no down payment and at a discounted interest rate. So leading up to 1971, you had 21 years of some of the finest economic growth in U.S. history. But and this was a period where we had demonstrated a commitment to shared prosperity. But what Lewis Powell was complaining about was that shared prosperity comes with a price. If working people and middle class people made enough money to where they could own a home, send their children to college, afford quality health care, the best foods, right? If they had time for vacations, if they could do this on one salary, right, then they had the ability to hold power accountable. And this was the complaint of Lewis Powell. Because what we had leading up to 1971 was the civil rights movement. We had the equal rights movement. We had the anti-war movement. We had a media. And remember, it's not this media today where all the talking heads are millionaires. No. Walter Cronkite, the icon, the pinnacle of American media at the time, was a middle class guy. He wasn't making six figures. Right. So you had a media that was working class and middle class. And they were empowered to hold government accountable. They brought down Richard Nixon. Okay. So Lewis Powell was complaining about, okay, the American corporation has lost control because yes, we have shared prosperity and the wealth are doing extremely well, right? But the cost is we can no longer control the narrative. If we want to make money fighting ridiculous wars like Vietnam and, profiting off the war machine, right? We can't have people protesting and the media showing the body bags and stuff like that. We can't have it because how are we supposed to? That's not good for business, right? So Lewis Powell wrote the Powell memo. And what he said was to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is, you're at risk of losing control of the country forever. And the only way you're going to regain control of America is if you invest more money than you've ever spent on anything to bend the government, the media, and the university system to the will of corporate America. That's what he said. Now, if you read the Powell memo, and it will be in the links for you to read it, right? It's very scholarly. He was a lawyer. He's brilliant. Okay. And so there's nothing incendiary in there. I gave you the summary, but you check me and tell me it doesn't say what I said it said. I mean, they lost control of the country. The only way to get control of the country is to bend these three organs of these institutions. And why? We have to break the back. This he didn't say, but this is the implications of bending the government, the media, and the university system to the will of corporate America. Corporate America can't get control unless the people cannot hold them accountable, which means that the implications is that our commitment to shared prosperity was too costly. So they were committed to break the back of shared prosperity. But it presented a second problem because historically, and they were well aware of this problem, if you consolidate too much wealth in too few hands, and therefore most of the population didn't have savings, and they were, if they worked, they ate, and if they didn't work, they didn't eat, right? So they had no savings. Whenever the economy slowed down, and it had natural cycles of slowing down. If it's slowing down, you're not selling as much business, you got to lay a few people off. If the people you lay off don't have any savings, and therefore any credit that they take out to support themselves defaults, then what a normal business slowdown, which is a recession, can mushroom into a depression. And this is exactly what we had every time you had a massive period of consolidation of wealth. The Gilded Age of the 1800s ended in nearly 10 years of depression in the 1890s, right? The Roaring 20s, right? Ended with the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression of the 1930s. So they were well aware. Their problem was, okay, they had to break the back of shared prosperity, but they had to figure out a way that when the normal recession would come, and these people who now don't have savings start defaulting on all their loans, and then the banks start going down and everything else, Great Depression, the depressions of the 1890s, we have to have a way to protect extreme wealth. And that is the connection between Richard Nixon closing the gold window and Lewis Powell instructing corporate America that it's time to break the back of shared prosperity, right? And this is the rest of the story I'm about to tell, because this is what makes sense. This is what makes sense of everything that happened thereafter. And much of this, if you're as old as I am, I will be 60 November 30th. But even if you're not, you may have studied this in school, or you certainly have a parent who went through this also. The point is much of this is easily observable based on people who lived it or from a historical data point. So make friends with your chat GPT because the data is publicly available and easily verifiable. Okay, so let me continue with the story. Because this is the story, again, of how extreme wealth chose to rig the U.S. economy. And that's why we are in the situation we're now. Unfortunately, in doing so, they broke it. We will get to that too. So, after Lewis Powell writes his letter to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, surprise, 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 Richard Nixon, the next year, 1972, appoints him to the U.S. Supreme Court. How about that? Right? And Lewis Powell goes on to be the leading corporatist jurist on the U.S. Supreme Court. Rest of his life. Right? Very scholarly. So what does that mean to us? By the time he was done, corporations were people. They had the same rights that we have. Right? They never had the same rights that we have. This is indicative of starting the process of bending the will of the government to the American corporation. Because you send Supreme Court justices to the Supreme Court who will then interpret the Constitution from the perspective of the interests, not of the American people, but of the American corporation, who are now one of the American people, apparently, right? Okay, this is where it came from. So that's what Lewis Powell went on to do. Okay, all right. But again, so everyone had their marching orders. And again, this is from the perspective of extreme wealth. So It's not a hard conspiracy to imagine when the entire class of the people involved all have the same incentive, right? If they can't make the money the way they want to make the money without controlling the people, if the people have the power to be able to hold them account, then they can't make the money the easy way that they'd like to make it. And so therefore, all these people are going to benefit by doing what? Figuring out a way to take all the money to themselves and not wind up jumping out the window like they did in 1929 at the stock market crash. Okay. So everyone started going to work in their own lanes. And we got to see it all. So, and was it 1979? Okay, coming into 1979, news was public service. The news divisions of all the major television stations, public service, supported by the entertainment division, which means, in essence, they were overhead. In other words, they weren't generating revenues. It was the entertainment divisions generating revenues and subsidizing the news divisions. But what that did was it freed the news division to just tell the news. That's what they did. That's what Walter Cronkite did. That's what the best of our historical news people did. They told us the news and they left it to us to decide what that meant. Oh, but all of a sudden, Ted Turner gets inspired, right, to start the first for-profit news agency, CNN, right, 79-ish, right? And this whole new trend occurs. We're going to shift the news division to its own self-supporting division, which would give wealth the opportunity to flood the zone with money. Because if you make the talking head a millionaire, that talking head now has something significant to lose. Again, this was the working class, middle class. And now you're going to make them a millionaire in order to tell the news. And so who pays them that money is absolutely going to control how they tell the news. And so all of a sudden we had a proliferation in the media over the course of the 80s into the 90s of different spins on news. So CNN was a little bit more center left. Oh, Rupert Murdoch, Fox News, the emergence, Rush Limbaugh on the radio, the emergence, popular conservatism. Right, great. And now we have Fox News. And all of a sudden, we have a competition. Everyone in front of that screen is making a bunch of money. And those organizations are printing money, making a bunch of money. Money is flooding into the media. And what progressively is happening is, as opposed to go back and get a copy of any Walter Cronkite, episode of news during any of the major events, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the first landing on the moon, any major event, and look at the difference between how a newsman covers the news and how these highly paid carnival barkers cover the news, because there's a gap, an emerging gap that inspires responses in us that Walter Cronkite never did. I mean, you might have a problem staying awake with Walter Cronkite compared to the way these news anchors tell the news progressively over the 80s and the 90s into the 2000s and on. Much more entertaining, much less informative, leaving us chasing our tails trying to figure out what the hell is going on. Okay. So this is the media lane and how wealth in that lane flooded the zone. And oh, by the way, Bill Clinton was helpful because, again, we had a history of anti-monopoly laws, break up the monopolies. Okay. So you had media very widely owned, thousands and thousands and thousands of owners, until Bill Clinton passed the Telecom Act of 1996. which then allowed extreme wealth to consolidate the media. And the rest is, well, all you have to do, go back to the Daily Show and Jon Stewart on Comedy Central through the 2000s and watch how a career can be made by simply showing the absurdity of hundreds of different newscasters telling the news of the day and reading from the same script. I mean, using the same words. You would think the English language only had maybe 100 because that happens when a few people own everything. Okay, so this is what happened to our media. Okay. Then, so that's information and how you control information, because information is power. So that's one. Lewis Powell was already working on the government. By the time he was done, there were numerous Supreme Court justices who were anxious to out-top him. So they have. So now the government, from the Supreme Court's perspective, Citizens United, the American corporation is more than a person. They have rights that we can't even dream about. Why? Because the corporate Citizens United, the corporations now can donate endless amounts of money to political campaigns. We're limited $6,000 each. But this person over here, right, who has all our rights, but they have these extra rights that we don't have, right? Went into the court. This wasn't legislation. This was the Supreme Court. Citizens United, they can now donate $1 billion to different campaigns. And it's like naked, open, blatant. So that then empowered the corporations to buy the politicians. Thank you, Lewis Powell and his progeny of jurists who have made the American corporation, in the phrase of Nietzsche, the Ubermensch. Right? Okay, there it is. Okay, so that's our government. Okay, that's why the politicians don't listen to us. And there's numerous examples of why they don't. Because they're already owned, right? And every time they run, right, and one of us try to get in and say something, we get outspent, outbought. Even if we sneak in, AOC, go back to her first campaign. She's from the Bronx, I'm from the Bronx. I don't know what happened to Jenny on the block because she's morphed into Nancy Pelosi. Why? That cash spent so good. Because it ain't the same person if you go back to her first election where she upset the other bought incumbent. Okay, so I'm just saying. Okay, so that's the strand of how you control our government, how money flooded that zone. And then we'll get into what they had our government do. Okay. I've talked about the media. Okay. On the university side, remember in the history books and all the videos and stuff like that you had these massive protests on campus. I mean, it was a hotbed, and why? Because the most brilliant professors were in the classroom doing what they were supposed to do. They were helping students learn how to think critically. Yes, the propaganda line was they were poisoning their minds in a particular ideological bent. No. Okay, you check it out. Right? All I'm saying is these brilliant teachers were helping, using scholarship, using the classics from the Greeks on up to help them process logic, challenge and be able to assess data, critical thinking, right? So that when Slick Suit steps before the camera and tries to tell them some nonsense, they have an independent way to validate whether it makes sense what they're being told. That's critical thinking. And so as a result, this is what empowered people to hold power accountable. We had access to university level education that actually taught people how to think and analyze complex problems, which are, which was more the norm. Life was getting more and more complex. Complexity is the con. But that's another, that we have that in another episode. Okay. Okay. So they had to, how do they get that brilliant teacher who's had a passion for teaching and has a way to resonate, convey, inspire, critical analysis, hone that, put it to practice in both in the historical sense and the practical application. What is happening today that's affecting your life that you can apply the skills that we're learning here in this university, right? That was what was going on. Oh, that shit that can't go on. What, are you kidding me? That's why they're holding us accountable. So therefore, how does the American corporation get in there and break that up? Once again, flooding its own money. So for the best and the brightest, we are a competitive market. Those better teachers, all of a sudden, American corporations start outsourcing their generalized research and development. There's a level of research and development that is just theoretical. It's exploring the sciences that relate to whatever good or service the business makes. So you have to, and it's out of that you innovate and create new products, right? And so you need real research and development, and corporations usually had that in-house. Okay. But what they said, they saw an opportunity. If we outsourced the research and development to the university of such and such, and then said, if you are a outstanding professor of any subject of any consequence, and you come over here and you do some research for us, right? We're going to pay you more money than you can ever dream about making, teaching those kids how to think. And what happened? It didn't take much long. It didn't take a generation, right? All of a sudden, what's happening in the classroom is you got 400 students being taught by a TA, and we're all reading the outline together. There's no critical thinking going on because the people who have an interest, who had the inspiration, who had the talent to inspire that kind of analysis and the application into the real world situation is over there getting paid in the research groups. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So all of a sudden, the only thing we're producing in our universities are rather docile, focused students who are not thinking anything about scholarship. The only thing they're there at the university for is, what can I learn to get me a six-figure job when I get out? Oh, and the corporations are all for that. Yes, learn this, learn that, learn this, right? Do that, and we will hire you when you get out there because you will be trained to be our, you know, automaton. Right? You're not engaged in any critical thinking. You're never going to hold us accountable. You're gonna make the widgets like we tell you to make the widgets, and we're going to pay you nicely to do it for a while. So that's what we have. All of a sudden, what happened to the hotbeds of critical thought and analysis, holding power accountable, saying, but you said connecting the dots. Oh no, you don't see that in the universities anymore. Now we argue about, oh my God, you said something that was offensive to me. You know, we are leaning this way and you're leaning that way. Oh no, we don't like that. That's okay. That's the kind of stuff we argue about. We don't argue about the serious things that are addressing the country. This is an area of scholarship, right? You would think this is where it should be argued. While most of us are out here working, we don't have time to debate all these massive issues. What are they doing at college if they're not debating the issues of the day that are important, right? But no, that's not what they're doing. What they're doing is learning how to punch that clock and get that suit on, and get into that cube, and earn their six figures, and shut up. That's what they're doing, and it's all greased to bend in the direction of the American corporation. So this is the application the Parliament. But we still have this massive problem. So we have the automatons coming out of the university system ready to work for corporate America. That's fine. But the inducement is this was get paid, at least upfront. You have the misinformation machine now taking over the media so that the American public won't have accurate information to know who to hold accountable. Okay, forget about that. You have a Supreme Court who's empowered the corporation to own the government, and those corporations now own the government, and they're having them do what corporations have government do, just like they have everyone do, serve the corporation. Okay. So the details in the economy started with Reagan. If we are going to break the back of shared prosperity, we got to stop this damn collective bargaining, right? Because what's the only advantage? Look at the history that got the benefits in the American corporation is that, oh, this corporation has 10,000 employees and the leadership is like 10 people. Oh, okay. You need the 10,000 employees, hard to replace if they work together. Obviously, this is their advantage. They strike, they unionize. Yes, the Pinkertons tried to beat the hell out of them for years. That was enough for a while until we stopped allowing that to happen. And ultimately, majority would rule, and the management had to be fair and reasonable, and it produced the greatest middle class and the greatest working class in recorded history. That was 1950 to about 1980. Okay, so we got to break that up. And so the first thing Reagan did was go to the heart of American unionism, public employee unions. So what he did was, which actually broke the law, but I guess as Nixon said, if the president does it, it must be legal, right? Excuse me. I digress. What Reagan did was he fired the air traffic controllers who were on strike. Fired them all. Well, if even the federal law does not protect the union, from striking, right? Well, I guess there's a new sheriff in town. And that set the death knell to American unionism. And all of a sudden, over the course of the 80s, a smaller and smaller number of American labor were participant in organized labor, participant in unions, were engaged in collective bargaining. And oh my God, the Republicans are brilliant. They came up with, tell me this doesn't sound like good marketing. They said, okay, we have to, since the majority of the country is labor, right? How do we peel off some of these people to vote for the stuff that's going to help the American corporation? Freedom. They love freedom. We've taught them to love freedom. Okay, here we go. So the Republican Party start perfecting right to work laws, particularly in the Midwest and the Deep South, where there seems to be maybe a more, shall I say this, emphasized priority for freedom. No boundary to the freedom. Wild, Wild West freedom, I guess. But they sold the story that collective bargaining violated the freedom to work. Why? Because, okay, so you have a shop, you have a job, you have a business that has 100 employees, and so working class, the working level, the non-management level, let's say, is 75 employees. Okay, so typically what would happen is, like majority rules in a democracy, if the majority of the employees want to collectively bargain, they could form a union. But here's the catch. The union needs support, so the union needs to charge fees. So in order to get the benefit of the benefits that the union is able to negotiate, you need to be a part of a dues-paying member of the union. And so what the Republicans said was, the wedge is they convinced some of those 75 employees that, well, hold it now. You should be able to get the benefits of the union, even if you're a non-paying member, right? And proof of that, and worse, right? And if you don't want to pay, if you exercise your freedom that you don't want to pay, but you want those benefits, they're telling you you can't work. So we are going to we say support legislation in your state that says you have a right to work, and it doesn't matter if the majority of your employees, your fellow employees, want that union. You have a right to work, and if they get the benefits of the union, you get them too. Okay, all right, that sounds great. From I guess if you for whatever you want something for free, right? Because you're all about the freedom. So why not get the benefits of the union for free? But what that does is it destroys the union. Because if you can get the benefits of the union without paying the dues, then why would the dues paying people continue to pay the dues, right? And all of a sudden, unionism is collapsed across the South, collapsed across Midwest, all of the places where people are so focused on freedom that they forget how they pay their own bills. Well, they did. And that's what happened. Okay, so that was the first thing. Break the back of collective bargaining. I mean, into the 2000s, less than 10% of American labor is unionized. That's how good they did. Okay, so that's the first thing. All right. Another thing is the American corporation needs labor. And as long as they have to have it, just like in any capitalist system, even as you're breaking the back of the unions, right? You're going to have to pay for it, particularly here in America where we have rules like environmental laws, right? Like don't poison the river that we drinking our water out of. Is that too much to ask? Right? Okay. But those things cost money, right? So therefore, American labor is well compared to places that have no rules and people who work for pennies a day. Okay, American labor is expensive, so we need to be able to help the American corporation to be competitive against all these other international organizations, businesses that, get the benefit of all that cheap labor with no environmental laws or whatever. So we need to liberalize international trade. And of course, once again, we're selling it based on free, free trade, right? Free trade. Who could argue against freedom? Okay. And we didn't, right? So here they come, both establishment sides, because again, by this point, the government really is owned. It happened in the 90s. We didn't even know it. The government really was owned because here comes Bill Clinton. He's the party of labor, right? And he joins hands with George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, who negotiated and liberalized GATT and negotiated NAFTA to open up trade amongst nations with no tariffs. Yeah, I know. Trump is, don't worry about that. We get to that. Okay. But with no tariffs. So free trade, that word free, across national lines. Okay. What that does, what they sold it as, is it will lower the cost of your goods. And so you could afford to get better quality goods because they're going to be cheaper to be made. That would be nice if the benefit of making them overseas was actually going to be shared with us. Yeah, well, okay, we'll see how that turns out because that was the argument Bill Clinton made. Free trade is great. I mean, seriously, don't you want to get Mercedes-Benz quality for, a Toyota price? Here, this is how you do it. Good. He bought that shit too. Okay. The rest of the story is that U.S. Well, again, since they're trying to break the back, that's why I talked about the Powell memo. You have to understand why they were motivated to do this. Historically, when you had innovation that lowered the cost of something, the customer benefited from the lower cost. No, no, no. This is a new day. Oh, I skipped a part. In 1987, there was a release of a movie called Wall Street. And once again, money is involved because now you got Michael Douglas, right? I mean, you got leading actors. Okay, so millions of dollars, big money's involved. Okay, so sometimes, I mean, it's just like, haven't you noticed that sometimes hubris and arrogance reveals itself because they just can't. They have to say the quiet part out loud. They have to show you how they're doing it. I'm just so good. Right? So here is extreme wealth in Wall Street. Gordon Gekko saying what? Popularizing that greed is good. I mean, we have a whole history where people would never say such a thing. Right? Everyone knew that people felt that way, but they wouldn't come out publicly, be so brash. Here was Gordon Gekko. Oh no, greed is good. 1987. I mean, 16 years after the Powell memo, announcing to those of us who are getting confused in college because they're not teaching us anymore, announcing, oh yeah, this is what's coming. Greed is good. And what greed is good translates is this. The only stakeholder, this is why Wall Street was actually accurate. The only stakeholder now that matters is the shareholder, Gordon Gekko, the raider coming in to take over the company. Yeah, the only shareholder, the only stakeholder that matters is the shareholder. The other stakeholders that make a business successful is the employees, the customers, the communities in which the business serves. These are all management. These are all stakeholders, and you need them. And to the extent that they coordinate and cooperate, you have an unbelievable corporation. But the new day that Gordon Gekko announced, the quiet part out loud, right? Hiding in plain sight because we're busy chasing our tails trying to just get the job in college, right? Greed is good. And so when Bill Clinton is selling this bill of goods about how when we lower the cost of producing our technology and everything, you're going to benefit because you're going to be able to afford the lower cost good. That's a nice thing to say when you're not already committed to breaking the back of shared prosperity. That's a nice thing to say when you're not already committed, when you don't already believe that Wall Street was a prophet speaking to what was coming, that Gordon Gekko was simply announcing very candidly how we're going to make decisions from now on. Right. Okay. And that means that you fast forward to today, Apple is one of the most profitable companies ever. How much does it cost them to make an iPhone? I mean, seriously. And how much do they charge here in the United States? Okay. Okay. So what globalization did was give the green light and the economic incentive to the people who are intent on breaking the backs of shared prosperity, making the working class and the middle class so buried under the weight of limited income, limited choices, stress, difficulties, whatever, that they don't have the time or the energy to hold anyone accountable. Okay? People who are intent to do that, globalization empowered them to find the lowest cost, best quality markets that have the lowest regulatory environment, the cheapest regulatory environments to produce the highest quality products, the latest innovations, and then sell them back in the United States for a premium. And they told us, and Bill Clinton told us, and Robert Reich, wherever you are, don't make me be like sensible woman. Don't make me be Pacino and sensible woman about Robert Reich and say, wherever you are, if you too, no, no. But Robert Reich was Secretary of Labor. And he talks today as if he wasn't on the scene when labor was sold down the river. Okay. The fact is that, yeah, these people were intent on breaking the back of labor. And they did so by killing collective bargaining, your capacity to negotiate, by incentivizing U.S. multinational corporations to take the jobs to other markets. And then there was supposed to be job training, right? Just like there was supposed to be job training when Bill Clinton ended welfare reform, ended institutional welfare, the permanent safety net. 2 years and you're out because you're going to get a good job and you'll be better than you were on welfare, right? Okay, except no job was there at the end. And you just didn't have the welfare. Well, okay, no job was there at the end for the American, the non-college educated American. They wound up doing what? When you take the textiles and you take the manufacturing away, they wound up doing retail, okay, which at no point paid the kind of money that they were making, you know, for generations doing manufacturing in the textiles, right? It just is. I mean, Archie Bunker. It's one of my favorite because wealth does reveal the truth. And all Norman Lear was revealing with Archie Bunker and All in the Family in 1970 or so was that this is the condition of the white working class in America. At that time, they were able to afford to buy a house. He was a longshoreman. He worked on the dock. He was a unionized worker, but he made enough money to own a house in New York City and send his daughter to college. And he had a pension, and he had health care, and he took his family on vacations. That was the American working class. Okay. Okay. No, that's too much power for them. That's what Lewis Powell was complaining about. That's what Bill Clinton was intent on breaking the back of, right? When he pushed the ratification of NAFTA, the liberalization of international trade. He greased the field for U.S. multinational corporations to make an awful lot of money because they were able to go bottom feed their labor and then sell it back for a premium to anyone who could afford to pay for it, which progressively was not us. Right? Okay. So this was the basic, globalization was the basic thing that allowed, with the combination of automation that put downward pressure on jobs. So rich businesses bought equipment that did not need brakes, that you just had to maintain the equipment. They didn't need benefits, right? That replaced some labor. That put downward pressure on the money you pay people, right? The fact that you can get cheaper labor elsewhere put downward pressure. Hey, you want a job or do I go to Mexico? I mean, they're dying to work, right? Okay, downward pressure. All these things put downward pressure. Okay. But the American corporation also knew that if the average American if we're paying them less money, they really can't afford the best things we can produce. So we're not going to get as much revenue growth, right? Because the discretionary income of the broadest part of the market is intentionally being squeezed. Okay, so how do we make money? We make money because now that the only stakeholder that matters is the shareholder. We make money now from cutting cost. So we're cutting salaries, right? We're cutting pensions. Archie Bunker had a non-contributing pension, retirement pension, not Social Security. That he had that too. He had it. Okay, that used to be normal. That the businesses over and above your salary paid into a retirement fund so you had a pension. That shifted into a contributing 401k plan, which in the beginning was wonderfully matched up to some percentage to show a mutual commitment that, with the company. And now you just have a situation where like 60, 70% of the country, because they're making so little, can't afford to contribute to a 401k plan, which then relieves the company from contributing because it's only a match. So basically, we have if whatever you save, whatever you're able to save for your retirement, you're on your own and you have Social Security. Okay, so they cut the retirement commitment benefit. Look what happened to health insurance. I mean, if you had an HMO in the 90s, right, right, adjusted for inflation, you weren't paying $500 or $700, anything crazy like that for your family. You were paying a really reasonable amount for a premium that no one was really complaining about. And your out of pocket was de minimis. I mean, seriously, I mean, co-pays, that's it. That was your HMO. And as long as you stayed within your network, you were good. And people got healthcare and they went to the doctor when they needed to go to the doctor and they engaged in threat. Oh, yeah. Now, I don't care if you work for Amazon, go look at their high deductible, what they call, I mean, the insurance is so bad. By the way, I happen to, at the trough of my banking career, when I was out of the industry trying to work my way back in, I went into insurance and became a licensed health insurance and life insurance agent. Oh my. Hopefully we will not have a podcast about that. But this is why I know something about this. This nonsense in insurance that we have now. So just imagine, you standard practice is to have a high deductible policy in which you're paying for a family, you're still paying like $500, a month or whatever for this high deductible policy. But if your family doesn't have comorbidities, which, interesting enough, that's becoming a rare thing these days. How about that? If you're actually healthy, you never spend over the deductible in a year. So just imagine you pay $6,000 or $7,000 in premiums, and your coverage doesn't start until after you spend what you would normally spend out of pocket for any doctor's visits or whatever that you have. Well, damn, you could be a health insurance company making $100 billion in profit. When you get that kind of policy, you don't pay out anything, and the person is not likely to, unless something catastrophic happens. Isn't that nice? Okay, that's how horrible the health insurance is now, and most people can't afford it right now. So that's where we are. So the American corporation shifted into, now we're making money by squeezing our employees. But they're not by themselves. The employees are not the only ones to get screwed. Because us, the customer, oh my God, we are cutting costs on how we produce these products. We're cutting costs on how long the product works. We're cutting costs on the materials and the ingredients, anything that makes it cheaper. Our emphasis is to make it shiny and new, to get it off the lot. Our emphasis is to make it tasty and attractive and make you just crave for some more at 2:00 in the morning. The fact that it might kill you in 10 years, not so much, because who's thinking about that, right? The fact that the vehicle is probably going to break down in the 2 years, and that when you go to fix it, it's going to be more inclined. It's going to progress. So all of a sudden, the difficulties associated with fixing it, well, you might as well just go ahead and buy a new one. Okay, yeah. Look at the quality of everything and tell me you don't see a trend line. That as opposed to us building things better, that last longer, that serve us, that have less defaults, right? Everything lasts just long enough to have to replace it again and replace it again. We have to have a protest over the ability to repair that, because things are intentionally designed so that you can't repair it. That's how bad this thing got. Right? That's what I'm saying. So they started making money by cutting costs at the expense of the customer, at the expense of the communities they serve, dump it in the river. I don't care if they're drinking the water. How many places in the United States are they doing this? Okay. That's what I mean. When you don't care about the communities in which you serve, when you don't care about the customers, your own customers that you serve, then you can make a fortune poisoning them, making sure they get diabetes and heart disease and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, no one in the tobacco industry is losing sleep over the fact that they proved in the 60s that cigarette smoking causes cancer. Oh, killing them. They were good customers. Thank you. That is what greed is good translates into. Okay. So this is the economics. But it wasn't, I mean, the thing about this, it wasn't enough. That would have been bad enough. That just gets us into the 2000s. But Bill Clinton, because, you know, they just really got to make sure that we don't have shared prosperity. So we move into this thing called financialization. First, in the 80s, we moved this movement. If you owned, and Archie Bunker would own stock, if you owned shares of stock, they would send you your certificates. And you were proud. And people were proud. Just like they would, you bought US Treasuries, they would send you your Treasury certificates. Okay. But there was this movement on Wall Street by extremely wealthy people, of course, that, technology, well, you got to save some trees. Maybe they were environmentalists, secret closet ones. We got to save some trees. If we digitize the securities, easier to track, doesn't cost as much money, you still own them, they're still yours. It's just digital. And we're moving to that technology. So they digitized. The first move was to digitize all securities. Simultaneously, they said, but okay, so traditional securities are you have a company that and the securities are the percentage of ownership, a certificate's a percentage of ownership of the company, whether it's privately held or publicly held. And that is generally what a security is. Okay. All right. So these, Wall Street people said, okay, well, but we can securitize other things like a mortgage, right? So you take out a loan secured by your house, someone is holding the loan. Okay, you can diversify the risk of the person who's holding the loan by selling that mortgage into the securities market. And this is called securitization, right? And oh, trust us, this only makes it more efficient. It only allows us to spread the risk better, which means that we're going to give you a lower interest rate. So you don't worry, this is good. Okay. So all of a sudden, while they moved from paper securities to digitization, they also expanded to securitize virtually everything. Student loan debt, car debt, mortgages, all types of stuff is getting securitized. Okay. So turn back to Bill Clinton and say, hey, Bill, listen, since we're making everything security and we're going to digitization, which means that we're going to have massive computers to house these things, right? Because we're not sending it to them, we're going to house them for it, even though they have a claim. Okay. We need the Uniform Commercial Code, which exists in every state, to make a couple of changes. We need your support because you're the head of the Democratic Party, and a lot of these states are Democratic, and we already got the Republicans on board. So what do you say? Okay. So, they didn't have a parade and a public announcement. Hey, I'm president of the United States and I've agreed that we need to change the UCC code. No, they just went ahead and started doing it. So from 1994 to 2004, yeah, W was involved, right? They changed the UCC code in two ways. They said, I think it's section 4 and section 5. Section 4 was the part that talked about your ownership interests in the security that you own. And basically, historically, when you used to get the certificate, our ownership interest was personal property, personal property. It was your personal property because it wasn't real estate, it was a security. So personal property. Well, we need to change that. And we're going to change it to, instead of it being your personal property, it's going to be you have a claim on the security equal to the value of the security. So if you bought the security at $100, your claim was $100. And as the value of that security changed, the value of your claim changed. But that was your ownership interest, was a claim against the value of the security. Seems innocuous enough. Okay. Other thing. Like I said, it'd be what they did with the collective bargain and all that stuff was bad enough. No. No, they got to make sure there's no way we can have shared prosperity. So they add this other provision, another change in Section 5, I believe it is, which basically says if you are the custodian, one of these entities behind the scenes that no one gets to see, but happens to hold all our securities because now it's digital, so it's in some supercomputer or whatever, right? You get the right, you get the right to take out financing and use our asset as collateral without telling us. Yeah, I know. I didn't stutter. Right. Okay. Now, all right. So slowly but surely it works its way across the state because somehow people in the great state of Mississippi and somehow people in, Oregon said, this makes perfect sense to me because they all agreed to it. Right. And then once it was done, thank you, George W. Bush, for picking up the baton from Bill Clinton in completing the mission by the end of his first term. Right? Once all 50 states had changed that law, then they changed the bankruptcy law, 2005 bankruptcy law. You can't make this shit up. They changed the bankruptcy law and they created a new, besides for gutting the bankruptcy protections for consumer debt, for student loan debt, for the debt that affects the working class and the middle class. Oh, yeah. Shredding our rights under bankruptcy law. Yeah, that was one thing they did. But the real poison pill was they created a new class of creditor. And this class of creditor, who by the legislation was to be defined by the courts, by the way, this class of creditor had an unimpeachable claim on the collateral of their financing. So if they lent some money and the person they lent the money to went bankrupt, any creditor who was in this category, it didn't matter if they committed fraud. It didn't matter if they killed someone down in Central Park. They had an unimpeachable claim on the collateral. So now think about this. So we changed all the UCC codes to say that the person holding our securities, the custodian or what have you, there's like 12 different entities, whatever, has a right to take out financing on our collateral without telling us. Oh, and by the way, we have the right to do the same thing. So basically they're allowing double dipping. Okay. But not for us, for Richie Rich, right? Okay. But if this custodian takes out a loan against from one of these creditors who are yet to be determined, because the legislation in 2005 doesn't say who are those special class of creditors, right? But they have an unimpeachable right to take our asset. And oh, did it happen? Okay. Fast forward to what Wall Street did in the mortgage-backed security industry. And we need to talk about this because all this is going to come together. Okay. But I will put a bow on the 2005 bankruptcy law stuff. So when Lehman Brothers filed bankruptcy in September of 2008, the reason why the Federal Reserve's hair was on fire and the Treasury Secretary's hair was on fire and Barack Obama and Senator McCain, both presidential candidates that year, suspended their campaigns to rush back to Washington to save the world, right? And in the most unbelievable sign of unity in a divided nation, right? Nancy Pelosi, Senator McCain, Barack Obama all voted to bail out Wall Street. Okay. Well, when Lehman Brothers, the reason why they did that, the reason why they said that the Fed said, Bernanke said, the chairman said, the economy will end if we don't bail out, okay, is because when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, the very rich people who were unaware of what the UCC code changes occurred, were unaware of what happened with the bankruptcy law in 2005, when they read or got notified that the investment bank that they were wealthy enough to give their assets to invest on their behalf had declared bankruptcy, they did like any one of us would have done. Called them up and said, transfer my assets, because it has nothing to do with your bankruptcy, transfer my assets over here to this other investment bank who's not bankrupt. And what were they told? I'm sorry, but your assets have been seized by JP Morgan Chase. Yes, seized by JP Morgan. But how's that possible? Because Lehman Brothers, as the custodian associated with your assets, because you gave them, they're holding your assets. You don't have the stock. It's all digitized. We're holding it. The UCC code in New York allows us to take out debt. We took out billions of dollars of debt with JP Morgan Chase, and now we're bankrupt. And as a result, to secure that financing, they are taking your assets, and it's unimpeachable. Google the bankruptcy judges, the court case. It's in English. You would be surprised. Even the judge was shocked. Because as we said, because of course everyone was accusing Chase of fraud and how this is possible. How could you, but in Lehman and fraud, how do you take out loans on our, or without telling us, without getting our consent, right? Oh, because it was all legal. And even if it wasn't, even if you find some sort of, malfeasance on the part of Chase or whatever, their claim is unimpeachable. Yeah. And so all the other rich people who didn't know that level of fix is this is the difference between rich and extreme. The extreme, of course, they know. They're on the right side of that. They were wearing Chase, right? All those people who had their money in Goldman, who had their money in the other investment banks, right? Citi, what there was a 1929 style run on the investment banks, and they were going out. Let me say that loud. They were going down. Right? That's why Bernanke's hair was on fire. That's why we had to bail them out. Right? They set this whole thing up. They set this whole thing up, and we had to bail them out because it was all coming down. Right? Okay. So we bailed them out. But again, wrap your brain around the magnitude of effort, years in the planning from 94 to 2004 to the 2005 bankruptcy law. Lehman doesn't go bankrupt. The first case that exposes what they did is September 2008. That's how many years in advance these people planned to rip everyone off. Right? Okay. Right. Then we had wealth. In 1980, 70% of the country owned a house. Something ridiculous, some high percentage, 60%, whatever. A lot of the working class from those generations, and it was in the family. So we had embedded wealth. They had to get in there and get that wealth, right? Because otherwise, how could they make us desperate? 1.5 nostrils underneath the waterline. You don't have any time to hold anyone accountable. How could they do that if you own a house, if you have if you have generational wealth? Oh, well, our man, Bill Clinton. coming to the rescue, ready to serve extreme wealth in any way he can. So he did a couple of things. Okay, the fundamental regulatory structure that really had shackled Wall Street after the shenanigans that led to the stock market crash in 29 and ultimately led to the run on the banks and the failure of the US banking system. Okay. FDR restored confidence by creating depositors insurance. But the condition for the taxpayer to insure the deposits is that the banks were restricted, commercial banks were restricted in being able to take the deposits and invest in speculative investments. They had to invest in safe investments. Okay. So when Bill Clinton, Richie Rich knew that Bill Clinton was their man that they had waited for. So the Travelers Insurance and Citigroup decided to merge, which was illegal based on Glass-Steagall, which was the signature regulatory law that restored the confidence, that saved the banking system in the 30s by separating insurance, investment banking from commercial banking. Commercial banking was where our deposits were going to be, where the FDIC insurance was going to be, where tighter regulations were going to be. And so therefore, commercial banks could not merge with insurance. But here was Travelers Insurance merging with Citigroup, right? Okay, so under Glass-Steagall, the Congress had 1 year to break them up. And oh, by the way, this wasn't a small merger. This was now the largest financial services company in the world. But they knew that their man, Bill, they had the right guy. He was going to let this thing go through. And lo and behold, the Congress, roger that, Democrats and Republicans agreed to repeal Glass-Steagall and allow our FDIC insured institutions merge with speculators, the kind of shenanigans that led to the stock market crash and the bank failure. That's Bill Clinton. But he wasn't done. No, because again, we got to get these houses away from these people. Okay. So literally on December 29th, 2000, Bill Clinton leaves office to 21 days later, on the 19th of January, 2001, he's out. So 21 days later, that's how late in his presidency he signs. I love to read this thing. The Commodities Futures Modernization Act, which essentially takes most of the rules that restrict complex type financial instruments that Wall Street uses, that restricts the derivatives market, which is another series of complex bets that Wall Street can do to make money. There were all types of rules that limited their ability to do this because this stuff is very speculative and very dangerous. Okay. Well, Bill Clinton, with that legislation passed on December 29th, 2000, 21 days before he leaves the White House, took the restrictions off. And empowered by that, listen to the scam Wall Street created. Okay, so they said, okay, rules are off. Okay. They're going to create something called a mortgage-backed security. Now, these things existed before, but this is a new day because there's no restrictions on them now. Okay. They're going to take something called a mortgage-backed security. And what that is a bundle, and we're going to make it simple. Let's say a bundle of 100 mortgages. And it has 5 tranches of 20, 20, 20, 20, 20. One tranche is 800 credit scores and above. No defaults in that history at 800 credit score and above. One tranche is 700 credit score. One tranche is 600. One tranche is 500. And one tranche is 400. So you got this bundle of all those different tranches of risk, with the top tranche being impeccable. They've never had a default. So Wall Street goes to the rating agencies because that's how we do it. The investment bank creates a security. Then the independent credit rating agencies review that security, and they say, based on our independent review, this is the risk of this security. AAA is the safest. Non-investment grade C minus or something like that is some crazy wild stuff, and you buyer beware. But because they're independent from the investment banks who create the security, we can trust what they say, right? So investment bank creates this bundle of 100 mortgages with all those varying levels of credit scoring. And they say to you, hey, Mr. Credit Bureau, Mrs. Credit Bureau, we have a security here. And I know at first blush you think that this can't be a AAA rated security, but it is a AAA rated security. And let me tell you why. Because those 800 credit scores, those 20, they are AAA rated. There's no history of defaults in that payment history, and they should get the same rating like the U.S. government because the government has never defaulted. Makes sense. What about these? These 80 over here. What about them 400 credit scores? No problem. We have purchased credit default insurance for them. We have an entity over here who is issuing out insurance for each of those levels of risk. And if any of them default, the insurance policy will pay the payments. And therefore, the entire bundle of 100 mortgages should be rated AAA because to the extent that the higher risk securities default, there's an insurance policy to make those payments. And Moody's and S&P and Fitch said, sound good to us, AAA. Now, why would Wall Street go through that kind of trouble? Right. Well, there's a whole category of institutional investors that either by law requirements or by practice of their industry are restricted to investing in the safest investments. AAA, maybe AA, but basically the safest investments. And those are like pension funds. So, a massive pension fund, the largest public pension fund in the United States for years has been the California Public Employees Pension Fund, CalPERS. Okay. Hundreds of billions of dollars. Right. So these type of funds, life insurance, are restricted, municipal investors, restricted to invest in the safest investments. So Wall Street said, how do we get these restricted investors? How do we get some of that money? Most of our business is too risky for them. We need to qualify for some of that money because there is $1 trillion out. There's so much money in that space that basically buys treasuries and things like that. So this was their game. They created this mortgage-backed security that they were able to get rated AAA by the independent rating agencies who, oh, by the way, never bothered to check whether the insurer who was guaranteeing the payments of those higher risk tranches had sufficient capital to cover the risk. Okay. And the reason why, well, they didn't check it, and there was no law that those insurance companies that made the promise to cover the promise to cover the losses of those higher defaulting risks, right? Was because Bill Clinton's, where is it at? His Commodities Futures Modernization Act took off the laws that said that was illegal. And so therefore, the investment bank was able to form a wholly owned entity to issue out the insurance to protect their bundle of higher risk securities in order to obtain a AAA rating from the rating agencies so that they can turn around and sell that risky bundle that's sold as AAA to your pension fund. Brother, I don't know if there's another reflection of financial evil more evil than that. But okay, so here's the thing. So now that the rating agencies have proven that they're willing to play ball, right? And they're willing to agree to that, and they're not going to do due diligence to make sure that the insurer has adequate collateral to offer the insurance they're claiming to offer. Okay. Now they need a lot of mortgages. In other words, they need to be able to create a lot of bundles because there is a fortune out there. And the thing about this bundle of securities is it's going because it does actually have higher risk. The return that that bundle does offer is higher than traditional AAA rated risk. Why? Because those things don't default at AAA level, so they pay the lowest interest rate. So the person at 400 and 500 and 600 credit scores paying a higher interest rate, so the blended interest rate of that bundle is higher than AAA risk normally gets. So this is a high incentive. The poor pension person over at CalPERS is like, well, S&P, I've been trusting S&P for 20 years and I've never lost. They said it's AAA, it's AAA. The fact that it's earning an extra point of interest on top of it, they didn't pass all of the blended interest. Oh, hell no. But the fact is, it's earning more interest than I would normally earn on a AAA rated security. I'm buying that. So you had hundreds of billions of dollars of restricted investment money teeing up, ready to come in. But we had to have mortgages to populate them. So the investment bank says, okay, we're going to offer a massive line of credit to the biggest mortgage companies out there. We don't have to name names. We're just going to offer, but you can find them. Who were the biggest? Who were the famous ones? Who failed? All that. Yeah. We're going to offer them a line of credit. And we're going to say, here is basically if they can fog a mirror, and you could use this money to lend them money. And you could charge your fees because they're shaky anyway. So you could get paid. And then we will buy them from you. So you're not carrying the risk. You're using our money to lend to them for 30 days. We're going to buy it back from you. You get your fees. It's a churn factory. You're going to make a fortune. And we get mortgages that we can put in these bundles and take it over to Fitch and S&P and Moody's. They'll stamp it AAA, and then we sell it to CalPERS. This is good. This is good for business. And that's exactly what happened. Now, everybody's trying to get paid. So you would think that that was a great enough deal for the mortgage company. Oh, no, they had to grease the wheels even more because they're trying to find as many possible people. Okay. So they start selling. The hook started being, if whatever your credit was and whatever your income was, however much it was verifiable and steady and stable, whatever your credit profile was, which ultimately would translate into a certain level of fixed rate mortgage, right? So let's say as a 700 credit score with fully verified income, you would get a 6% 30-year fixed rate mortgage. So in order to grease the wheels and make more money, the mortgage broker would say, listen, I can get you 6% in a day, but why pay 6% when I can get you 3% fixed for 3? And then after you pay your payments, which will be considerably lower at 3%, you just refinance before it adjusts. Now you can do that, or you can get this 6% and you can be safe. What are you going to do? Well, most people under those circumstances are saying, well, yeah, because it never even occurs to you that you're not going to be able to refinance. If you make your payments and the principal is going down, you have a seasoned loan, you absolutely will refinance. You'll be able to refinance. Okay. So you're not even going to pay attention to what happens on the back end when if you don't refinance and the rate adjusts. Well, why is that relevant? Because you're going to refinance, and there's no reason why you would think you can't refinance. Now, if you were the smartest consumer in the country, and you said, but I want to still understand my risk on this. So what my risk would be, okay, so now I'm going to look at what that language is on the adjustment if I can't refinance and see what the language was. And what they would have found is this, because things have been deregulated. It used to be a time that you could only adjust the rate 1%, 1 percentage point per adjustment period. Not anymore. But so what the language, typical language you're going to find is the change in prime over the 3-year period plus 3% or plus 4%. So smartest person in the market. Okay, what's my historical change in prime over a typical 3-year period? Well, the answer to that, if you look at, let's say, 60 years of history, is that the most severe change in prime, right? Okay, just counting to 1981 when Paul Volcker went crazy and raised the prime 11%. Okay, that's anomaly. It was like 2%. So you say, okay, so my 3%. So if the change in prime goes up 2% plus 3, that means my 5%, my 3% would go up 3 plus 2, 5 plus 3 is 8. So what my risk is I'm going ahead and I'm not going to pay 6% now. I'm going to pay 3%. But at worst case scenario, I'm more than likely wind up at 8%. So, sell the house, get out of this or whatever. But it's okay. So even if you were that smart and could make that decision, but no one did that. Why? Because it was not necessary because you were going to refinance before it adjusted. Okay. And the reason why the mortgage company did that is because when they sold the loan to the investment bank, you can't make this shit up. When they sold the loan after 30 days to the investment bank, right? They can make a premium if the blended 30-year interest rate, was higher than the 30-year fixed rate that credit profile would qualify for. So what did I just say? So the credit profile we're using in our example is a person who can get a 6% fixed rate mortgage for 30 years. If they get an adjustable rate mortgage and their first 3 years is at 3%, and based on the data that I showed you, that the 2% adjustment it would be normal over the 3-year period, and it was change in prime plus 3, then for 27 years, they were going to pay 8%. So you have 8%, the average of 8% for 27 years and the average of 3% for 3 years. And the blended average is, let's say, to keep it simple, 7%. So basically you have a 6% risk paying 7%. And that's going to pay a kicker to the mortgage company, which incentivizes them to make that back end adjustment as crazy as possible because no one is paying attention to it because they plan on refinancing. But that determines their back end kicker. So that's what they did. Change in prime plus 3, change in prime plus 4 is normal. Okay. So what can go wrong, right? Wall Street has convinced the rating agencies to allow them to put AAA rating on these mortgage-backed securities, no matter what they have in there, because anything that's not an 800 credit score and above has mortgage insurance, and no one is checking to see if the insurer can actually cover those defaults. And then they're turning around and they're selling it to pension funds who are happy to take it because they're getting a higher return than AAA rated risk normally gets. And so this is going on like clockwork in 2002, 2003, 2004. This is why anyone who was an adult who lived through that period of time, I don't care what you did, how you did it, you could get a house, you can get 3, you can get anything, right? All right. So, but what happened is eventually the billions of dollars that CalPERS, we'll keep on using them as an example, that CalPERS bought these securities that they thought were AAA. The underlying risk, the 400 credit scores are going to start defaulting, like 400 credit scores default. And when CalPERS goes to the insurer to cover the defaults, that insurer is going to quickly run out of money and not cover the defaults. And now CalPERS is starting to lose money that they don't expect on AAA risk. And so what eventually happened is, by the end of 2006, institutional investors across the board said, we no longer believe these ratings. These ratings are not AAA because we're getting a higher default rate than AAA risk. So therefore, we're not buying them anymore. And what that did was create the scenario where whole categories of refinancing could not happen. Why? Because there was no end buyer. The end buyer was the institutional investor, and they're not believing the risk rating anymore. So people were at closing tables in the spring of 2007 and couldn't fund. People who had that 3% fixed rate mortgage for 3 years and had the back end adjustment that they didn't worry about goes to refinance and can't refinance because there's no end buyer. The mortgage company is not going to hold it past 30 days. And unless they know that the investment bank is taking it off their hands, and the investment bank is not taking it off their hands if they don't have anyone to sell it to, then all of a sudden you can't refinance. And so for the first time in U.S. history, we had thousands of rate adjusted foreclosures. Right. In other words, that person who was paying 3% had change in prime plus 3, change in prime plus. So let us check. This is 2007. What's the change of prime? If you had a 3-year, I got it right here. Data. So what was you can't make this shiza up. Okay, the change in prime the change in prime that led into 2007. Prime went up 4.05% over, let's say, a 4-year period. So let's say 4% increase in prime, double the historical average. We get into the Fed's activity, involved in that. So you're talking about change in prime plus 3. That's 7%. So the 3% fixed now is paying 10%. And if it was change in prime plus 4, they're paying 11%. And that's why they foreclosed. They could not get out. And who the hell who would qualify for 6%, fixed for 30, could afford to pay 10% on that asset? And what did Richie Rich start doing? That's Rick Santini in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange in the spring of 2009, raising his fist at the camera on CNBC and accusing the person who's foreclosing of buying too much damn house, accusing them of gold-plated bathroom fixtures. And why should us working men, bankers, they ain't busting rocks, but okay, why should us working men bail them out? When it was the bankers and the mortgage companies who set them up like that bad. Oh, there's a special range of evil. But we are not even done yet. Because, as I told you, it led to Lehman Brothers. Because, the problem with Lehman Brothers is they were on the short end of the stick in more ways than one. In the same way that Washington Mutual that failed in the spring of 2008, Bear Stearns that failed, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac had to be taken over by the federal government. All these people were on the short end of the stick because there were some people, some investment banks who happened to know, no, we're not, we are the ones who own the insurers, who we undercapitalized and couldn't cover the defaults. which set off this death spiral in the first place. So we know this is going to blow up. But thankfully, Bill Clinton came to the rescue because when he passed the Commodities Futures Modernization Act, he now took off the shackles of an old dinosaur called a credit default swap. And a credit default swap is an unregulated insurance policy that allows you to make a bet on any type of risk, whether you have an interest in it or not. So, a few banks who knew that the AAA rating wasn't really AAA went to AIG, right? The world's largest insurer. They said, hey, how would you like to make tens of millions of dollars helping us insure our AAA rated securities? I know when AIG first heard that, they figured there must have been drugs involved because a AAA rated security had never defaulted. So what kind of insurance policies? Why would you need insurance on that? And maybe that should have tipped them off to something. Oh, but no, because the money was good. From their point of view, when an insurance company is trying to underwrite risk and you're the safest risk, right? Well, okay, that means it could be a very nominal premium, but they kind of suspected that there's something wrong here. So instead of paying a de minimis premium, they charged them, said, okay, we don't understand what's going on here, but there's a reason why you want to buy insurance. So if you're willing to pay some real money, we'll issue out you $20 billion or so in insurance on that kind of stuff. Sure. And they did. So if no one ever explained to you why the world's largest insurance company had to be bailed out by us to the tune of $180 billion, it's because the investment banks who understood that the mortgage-backed securities that were rated AAA weren't really AAA took out an unregulated insurance policy that was so big that the largest insurance company in the world went bankrupt when it came time to pay. That bad. Hey, but the brilliant thing about us, the American people, is we smelt a rat. And we had our man. We just elected, yes, we can. Right? There's no way. If we elected John McCain, maybe he'd have done something shady. I don't know. I love John McCain, by the way. But we elected, yes, we can. He only in America. So I know we went out there with the placards in front of AIG after Obama raised his right hand. And we said, now that we own AIG, now that we bailed them out $180 billion, we noticed there's a couple of these banks over here with, it's not just their hand out, with the Grand Canyon out to AIG saying, you owe us billions and billions and billions of dollars. So bright-eyed and bushy-tailed Americans who smelt the rat, who even though, this is some complex 12-dimension chess that Wall Street was playing on everyone. But we figured it out enough to know that, oh, hell no. If the pensioners got crushed, I mean, literally people were making $2,800 after 40 years in the coal mine or some shit. And all of a sudden they're paying $1,200 because their pension funds got wrecked by this nonsense that Wall Street did, right? If they were not bailed out, whoever these banks are over here with the Grand Canyon saying, give me billions and billions of dollars of tax money to pay for losses that we experienced in a context that destroyed all these other people. Oh, hell no. They're going to take a shave. Go back and look at the news in like February of 2009. We were picketing. You and I. Well, maybe not you and I, but us, American people. They weren't physicists. They weren't from MIT. They weren't from the Wharton Business School. They were Americans, just regular folks who understood that this shit is wrong. It ain't going down like this. And what Obama said. But what they did, everything they did was legal. And I do not have the power to interfere with the contracts associated with that insurance policy, even though the contract was made with a company that's now bankrupt. He's a lawyer, you know. Boy, you can't make this, you know. So therefore, while millions of Americans lost their homes to the shenanigans, while millions of Americans lost their jobs, lost their savings, lost their pensions, lost their retirements, credit got destroyed, families got ruined, health. Obama let not only bailed out Wall Street, but allowed the ones who knew it was rigged, that it was bullshit. Excuse my French, I'm sorry. If this doesn't warrant it, he made sure they got paid 100 cents on the dollar. And you know what they did? While all that suffering was going on in 2009, they paid out the highest bonuses in their history. They were partying like it was 1999. That evil. So it goes on. It got replicated again in COVID with the CARES Act. Too much to cover there. My point being, this is the intentionality. This is how extreme wealth broke the back of shared prosperity. This is how the middle class, the average middle class household in America cannot afford to buy a house in the average American city. Middle class. This is how we find ourselves based on Federal Reserve data that for the first time in U.S. history, the top 1% had more wealth and income than the American middle class. Okay. So the Rand Corporation did an analysis that showed that if we took the income distribution that the United States had from the end of World War II to 1974, 1945 to 1974, and we use that same distribution of income from 1975 to 2020, when the report was done by the Rand Corporation, that every working American in the bottom 90% should be paid over $600,000 in back pay, and that was unpaid. That the aggregate amount was a $50 trillion transfer of wealth that went from the middle class and the working classes to the top 10%, and primarily the top 1%. That's how we got here. That's how they rigged this economy. It wasn't that they were better and smarter, that they earned it, that they innovated. They literally broke the economy by creating rules that allowed them to take out debt against our assets without our permission, while we were allowed to take out debt too, so they can make double, triple, quadruple bets. Yeah. Dig into the synthetics market, dig into the derivatives. Yeah. They're wagering all types of insane things. And that's how they make their money. And we're not allowed to do it. We don't even know about it. That's why they have that wealth. They've turned the entire system to the interests of extreme wealth. They have effectively bankrupted our government. Over the same period of time, from 1992 till today, we go from $4 trillion in federal debt to $38 trillion in federal debt. Up to 1992, that's 216 years of American history. In 33 years, $34 trillion in debt. And who got the money? Who got it? Because that's excess spending over and above the taxes, right? That's why it's dead. It went to the private sector. It went to create the wealthiest billionaire class ever or in recorded history. Any one of these most notable billionaires have more money adjusted for inflation than the Gilded Age. I mean, that's what they did. And all of us are much worse off. So yeah, they achieved their goal. They broke the back of shared prosperity. And in doing so, they broke the country. They broke the economy. So, where does this leave us? Where does this leave the American dream? You know, I asked my chatbot, because chat is great for data analysis. I asked my chatbot, what is the consensus in America of the middle class American dream? And what chat said is, based on all these sources, it is the ability to own a home, the ability to go on a vacation, annual family vacation, the ability to save for college for your children, the ability to save for your retirement, and the ability to access healthcare, quality healthcare. And so then I asked chatbot, okay, well, how much does that cost in America today? All types of analysis come out, all types of data, this and that. And we got the data, and it's a range because it depends on where you live. It costs a minimum of $150,000 a year, household income, and a maximum of $225,000, depending on where you live. Okay, so that's the cost of the American dream. Middle class dream, accessible dream. Okay. Well, what do Americans make? As it turns out, 60% of American households make less than $105,000. Yeah. The annual income range that has the highest percentage of American households is between $50,000 and $55,000. Yeah. So this is what is left of the American dream. 60% of the country is a third of the income away from the lowest threshold of access to the American dream. That's how successful extreme wealth was in breaking the back of shared prosperity. So then what is the breadcrumb? Thank you, Kevin, for that story. No, I'm just going to go hang myself. No, what is the breadcrumb that's available to us here? Knowledge is power. That's why they destroyed their university system. Knowledge is power. And now we know how the system got rigged. It's not just a campaign slogan that Bernie Sanders says, that Donald Trump said on the stage with all them Republicans, that I donated to every one of these campaigns, every one of these politicians over the course of my life. And when I call them, they take my calls and they do what I say. That's how it's rigged. Yeah. Okay. We can do more than just hearing these few politicians say the quiet power out loud. We have the power now that we see what has been done, that we can demand. And this is paraphrasing George W. Bush when he was talking about the surpluses that he inherited from Bill Clinton's budgets. He said something to the effect that now is the time to give the surpluses back to the Americans who earned it. And hell yes, now is the time to give the $50 trillion back to the Americans who earned it. And we all know who got it. And now we know how they got it. And it wasn't earned. It wasn't fair and square. It was rigged. And now it's incumbent on us to ask ourselves, what are we going to do about it? We do have a system. We still are 340 million Americans. We do have elections. We use the information. That's the breadcrumb. To hold power to account. Prove them wrong. Just because most of us have a nostril and a half underneath the waterline. Prove them wrong that you're not capable of holding them to account. Because our government, who took that much money from us, can make sure to get it back. And that is the breadcrumbs for episode 5. I don't even know what the time was. I don't think this was a 2-hour length, but I know I did pretty good over an hour. I really appreciate your time. It's really important that we take the time to unravel the things that put us in a place that we would never want to be. Because that's essential for us to understand how to get out. That's what makes a breadcrumb a breadcrumb. It's because we forgot something. But as soon as the breadcrumb reminds us, now we know what to do. And now you know what to do. And this is Breadcrumbs, a podcast for people who know it's not working. Thank you so much. You take care. And I will see you next time in the conversation.